One of the most fun things about this conference are all the sidebar conversations. So glad that everybody did that, enjoyed the time over lunch. I'm Brad Gentry. I'm Associate Dean for Professional Practice here at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and a lot of my work is around how do you finance land conservation or finance open space. So this panel on sustaining parks is near and dear to my heart. I think we'll be talking a fair amount about some new models, both for building constituencies who see values, but then also translating those constituencies and those values into the funding for parks that so many people said we don't have enough for capital, or we don't have enough for maintenance, or we don't have enough for programming. So we have a wonderful array of speakers. Catherine Nagel is going to start us off with kind of a national perspective from the City Parks Alliance. Sarah Charlop-Powers is going to talk about, sort of building on the last panel, the wilder side of things, the New York Natural Areas Conservancy. And then Mark Wilson's going to talk about the public health side and how do we connect into those communities. I'd like to hold questions till the panel, and I'm also going to give the panelists an opportunity to ask each other questions. Since we've got three such experts across these areas, it'll be fascinating to see what kinds of questions they might ask, and then we'll open it up. And we'll finish before our keynote at about 2:45. So Catherine is the Executive Director of the City Parks Alliance, which is a remarkable network of people who care about parks. And Catherine has taken it into new areas, not only of pushing for increased federal funding and doing training and whatnot, but affiliating with the RAND Corporation and NIH and others to do a multi-year nationwide study around parks and usage and how we might build more in that area. Obviously, a lot of that work is thinking hard about what are some of the innovative funding strategies that are out there, particularly involve bringing the public and the private sectors together and increasingly blurring those boundaries between the two in pursuit of better parks and better park experiences. So with that, Catherine.
Well, good afternoon. And it's really wonderful to be here. I was telling Brad earlier, you know, most of my day-to-day work is really focused on keeping a nonprofit together. And those of you who do that work know it's a lot of administration and fundraising. And this has been so wonderful to really think about the core of our work and to think about the questions that are really hard to answer. So thank you all at Yale for pulling this together. As Brad mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about public and private funding strategies for urban parks, but I wanted to first follow up and just talk a little bit about City Parks Alliance and who we are. We are the only nationwide membership organization that is solely focused on urban parks, and we were founded 15 years ago. We unite and serve a growing network of organizations, both public and nonprofit. Many of our members are here in the audience, as well as professionals, community-based organizations, funders, and others who are working to increase investment in our nation's urban parks and to have them recognized as a vital part of our national infrastructure. Dan Jones will be one of the speakers this afternoon, and he's on our board. But at the heart of our work is to share information about the tremendous innovation that's going on at the local level. And it's pretty extraordinary when we look around this country to see how communities are really rising to the challenge and really creating new models for how to sustain these public assets. As you know, and as you've heard in the conversations this morning, we are an urban nation, and the majority of this country lives in urban areas. More than 75% of the country lives in about 3% of the nation's landmass. And so as these cities and their surrounding areas densify, or as they work to attract people back to the urban core, parks are increasingly recognized as an important tool for high quality of life, for community health, for improving the environment and attracting investment. But leaders everywhere are faced with the challenge of how to create a sustainable funding stream for parks as these public budgets continue to fall short and the need rises. And civil society is playing a more significant role to address this issue. In a city like Detroit, as you heard this morning, emerging from bankruptcy, the citizens themselves are keeping some public assets functioning, with volunteers and nonprofits like the Greening of Detroit maintaining parks and playgrounds. Belle Isle Park, a great Olmsted design icon in the Detroit River, contains an aquarium within it that's entirely run by volunteers. And a volunteer group called the Mower Gang uses donated equipment to maintain more than a dozen neighborhood parks in the rest of the city. At the same time, we've seen a surge of downtown signature parks, a new wave of these large-scale landscape projects like the High Line in New York that have been supported with civic investment from individuals and private foundations through public-private partnerships. These spectacle parks are expensive to build, to design, program, and maintain, and they often require much more than what's available through public budgets. For example, the High Line has received about a quarter of its funding, or about $44 million, from the Friends of the High Line nonprofit, while the remainder has come from the city, state, and federal sources. So we're in a new era of park making that's using these hybrid models that is blurring the line, as Brad mentioned, between the traditional roles of the public and private sector. What I'm going to briefly cover today is the range of these funding strategies that cities are using, not only for entire park systems, but for specific parks within those systems. And cities do contain a variety of park types, from pocket parks between buildings to wilderness areas on the edge of cities, and each of them has a different funding need. It's a lot of information to cover, and I'm really just going to touch the tip of the iceberg, but I hope that it sets the stage for the speakers who will follow me. So the traditional route to support public infrastructure, as you know, is through taxes. And in some cities, citizens are choosing to tax themselves to improve parks. Grand Rapids citizens recently approved a parks millage that's expected to bring in $30 million over the next 7 years. It's an increase of about approximately $45 per person annually in property taxes. Even a city like Minneapolis, which has one of the best funded systems in the country, is gearing up for a referendum that would raise about over $200 million over the next 15 years to take care of its neighborhood parks, where they're addressing a huge maintenance backlog. And some cities like Boulder use a portion of a sales tax to fund their parks. In an ideal world, parks would be run by an entity with a taxing authority and some budget autonomy, so that they wouldn't have to compete with schools and fire departments and police departments. And last year in Seattle, voters approved Proposition 1, which created the Seattle Park District, and is a special taxing district. It's become the envy of park departments nationwide because it now has its own dedicated funding stream. Chicago has its own special district, but not every state allows their formation. So where citywide park districts aren't possible, certain areas of the city can function as tax-generating microdistricts where funds are collected for a specific purpose. And so you've probably heard of a business improvement district, or BIDs, areas where co-located businesses are willing to tax themselves to improve the conditions of the public realm in that area. Of course, the most well-known is Bryant Park in New York City, but there's a great example of this in southwest part of Washington, D.C., where there's a huge new development project. Canal Park is actually now managed and operated by the Capitol Riverfront BID. And I think there's an interesting synergy there, because these downtown parks require high levels of programming and activity and maintenance, and often these business improvement districts, which have been tasked in the past with keeping the public realm, the sidewalks clean and green, are in an ideal position to do that work. But park agencies don't always have to turn to additional taxes to fill their gaps in their budgets. As you've heard this morning, parks are being designed to address a variety of issues, economic, environmental, and social, And with the multifunctionality of parks, we've seen an increase in cross-sector collaboration between park departments and other public agencies. So instead of competing for park budgets, some park agencies are working more closely with other agencies like water departments and transportation departments to share funding and leverage public dollars for greater impact. And you'll hear from one of our speakers in this panel about how a health department is doing that. So we're seeing more of these public-public partnerships as parks are designed to be more integrated into the urban fabric, and a little bit different from that Olmstedian ideal where you're going to be sort of away from the city. These parks are now very much a part of the essence of the city, especially using green infrastructure. And billions of dollars are going to be spent in the coming years as cities work to comply with EPA regulations. And so particularly, with parks and water departments, we are going to see more collaboration. This is a picture of Thornton Place in Seattle. It's a mixed-use, mixed-income development that has incorporated 2.5 acres of green space that's capturing all of the water and reusing it. And it was actually funded through the Seattle Public Utilities Department with support from the State Department of Ecology. In addition to sharing revenue, parks can create their own. In urban areas, parks are well positioned to take advantage of entrepreneurial opportunities. Parking and programming fees are the most common ways to generate non-tax revenue and can be citywide or park-specific. For instance, the Chicago Park District owns some parking meters and parking garages, which generate a significant amount of revenue during special events like the one you see here, Lollapalooza. And that event also raises funds for the parks. Post Office Square in Boston was actually built over an existing parking garage. And you can see the ramps on either side of the park. It nets most of its operating revenue from the parking fees below. And of course, park agencies also will charge fees for the use of amenities like skating rinks and golf courses, which experience heavy use and need extra amounts of maintenance and operations. Revenue can also be generated through concessions, where private entities run services like restaurants, such as the Shake Shack in New York's Madison Park, or equipment rentals, and the park agency takes a percentage of the sales or raises revenue by leasing the space. Most new parks have buildings that are designed for rentable space for special events. And some park departments are working to support community-based entrepreneurs. Dolores Park in San Francisco, for example, contracted with a woman who has her own business. She calls herself the Empanada Lady. It's in a historically Latino neighborhood, and she sells culturally appropriate food in the local park. Naming rights are also a popular way to raise revenue, as are corporate sponsorships, which usually focus on certain programs and events. But the big shift in the past few decades has been around the actual governance models with the formation of public-private partnerships. And these have taken on a variety of roles, from programming to planning to fundraising and even maintenance and operations for parks and park systems, relying on that private and civic support. The granddaddy of them all is Central Park Conservancy, which grew out of an effort in the 70s to address the degraded conditions of the park. And today it raises close to $40 million annually, or about 75% of the park's annual expense budget, and it's responsible for the day-to-day maintenance and operations. And it's truly become the gold standard worldwide. After Central Park Conservancy was formed, many other cities adopted that model. Many of them, as you've heard this morning, were cities that had the historic Olmsted design parks or park systems. But today we see hundreds of these groups around the country, from friends groups to the Conservancy model, taking care of old parks and new parks alike. They are also being adopted by cities in place that's beyond our border. And I've talked with a number of people in European cities who are looking at how the Americans are doing it, and these are in countries that have historically relied on government support. And one of the interesting things about the evolution of these partnerships is that even beyond the simple fundraising and programming, they're beginning to do more work around research. And you'll hear more about that in this panel. And then also taking that research to be stronger advocates to ask for more public dollars to go back into the parks. So it's kind of come full circle. We appear to be in the golden age of park philanthropy, where wealthy donors are giving unprecedented amounts of money to design and build parks. Last year in Tulsa, the George Kaiser Family Foundation announced a $350 million gift to fund a park, surpassing the $100 million mark donated to Central Park by hedge fund manager John Paulson. We are just in Houston with our board, and we saw there that the Kinder family has made significant donations to signature parks like the historic Herman Park, downtown Discovery Green, and most recently announced a $50 million gift for the restoration of the bayou, the Buffalo Bayou. So where does park funding go from here? I think all cities are looking at how they can capture the value that parks create. If you look at the New York Times Magazine on Sunday and you see advertisements for new developments in Brooklyn, every single one of them has an image of a green space or a local park, and yet often those developments are not required to contribute anything. So some cities have taken it upon themselves to request that developers give their money to a pool of funding which helps not only support that local park but other parks in the city. There are some zoning strategies that are being used, but it's an ongoing issue, and cities are trying to figure it out. For me, the biggest issue is how to fund the neighborhood parks. Neighborhood parks are often smaller. They're harder to attract investment in. Those neighborhoods might not have the wealth or the connections or the capacity to form the robust nonprofits that are needed to restore them. And I think this is an issue that cities are beginning to address as well. There are two interesting projects that I wanted to highlight as we think about where some of the funding models are going. The first is from the land of innovation in San Francisco. It was just passed this summer, but there's a neighborhood, the Dogpatch Potrero Hill neighborhood, which has implemented the micro-district idea and formed a green benefit district, and I think it's the first in the nation. It functions like a BID, like a business improvement district, but it's in place to serve the entire residential neighborhood. And through extensive community engagement, the local property owners have approved a special assessment on themselves. And in this case, they're going to be funding the improvement of the local parks, the existing spaces. They'll be funding the improvement of sidewalks in the public realm, and also using some of the funds to create gardens and more open space and parks. Being in San Francisco, they're also developing their own app. So they're going to be using that for crowdsourced reporting of maintenance and operations. And I think it's particularly important as we look at green infrastructure, which actually is going to require more maintenance, that cities think about, how some of these districts can function to take care of those smaller spaces. One of the other areas of emerging interest, again, is this link between housing and parks. And New York, again, one of the most innovative cities in the country, has used a community benefit corporation to actually develop real estate adjacent to a park. The revenue from that is taking care of the maintenance and operations from the park. As the commissioner can tell us, it's been a very controversial effort, and so other cities are taking note. These new collaborative models of funding city parks aren't a simple solution. In fact, they're a hard solution to hard challenges, but they're a reality. And in many cases, these partnerships are driving incredible innovation. But they're filled with the challenges around shared vision, leadership, who's in control, transparency, communication, equity, and long-term sustainability. And in response to this, the City Parks Alliance is developing a training program on park partnerships to teach the skills for collaborative governance. And we're developing a curriculum and actually a set of case studies like they use at the Harvard Business School, doing role-playing to help communities be more effective in their partnerships. This program complements our ongoing webinar series, which focuses on all the aspects of park partnerships. There's a great one coming up on December 1st. And if you'd like to really immerse yourself in this topic, I encourage you to join our next International Urban Parks Conference in the Twin Cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis, where we'll learn how two cities are actually working in partnership to create a cohesive park system. So thank you, and look forward to the continued conversation.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That gives us a rich menu of things to talk about and ponder on. Sarah's going to build from one part. You mentioned the Central Park Conservancy and the amazing work that's been happening around an iconic gathering place for everybody. Sarah's had the really interesting project of thinking about the 10,000 plus acres of natural areas around New York that are less iconic, at least in many people's views, and how do we build partnerships around those? So I will now get off the stage. Let you go.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks to Colleen and Brad and all of the organizers. I also want to just acknowledge that I have many of my colleagues from the Natural Areas Conservancy and from the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation in the room. So excited to share the space with them today. My first few slides actually cover a lot of similar case studies, just to give a little context specific to New York. About sort of the evolution of public-private partnerships and specifically how some of the things that have been successful within the realm of New York have some limitations when it comes to funding and thinking about sort of prioritizing work in natural spaces within New York City and really sort of natural spaces in cities everywhere. I'm going to then segue to talking a little bit about some of the unique challenges and also some of the unique opportunities of working at a regional scale on natural resource management as a private sector entity. And then I want to take a few minutes at the end to just talk about a couple of models that are either sort of newly released in New York City or things that are sort of on the docket as ideas that are being explored as potential new revenue streams. I want to also just mention there's a lot of photos of natural spaces in this presentation, and all of those photos are taken in New York City. So as I talk about some of the more sort of traditional inner, like big ticket park projects in the first few slides, and then segue, I want you to be aware that you're looking at images that were taken within the 5 boroughs. So I'll keep these first few slides really brief. As Catherine mentioned, Central Park Conservancy in many ways is sort of the iconic public-private partnership, certainly in New York City and really around the world. And one of the things that's made the Central Park Conservancy really successful is that it's surrounded by some of the most wealthy real estate in the world. And so a huge portion of the funds that are raised historically and currently in Central Park come from people who either live or work in close proximity to the park. Similarly, Bryant Park happens to be located in an area in Midtown Manhattan, very close to Grand Central Station, large, iconic public features like the Central Library for the New York Public Library, and the business engines that drive the New York City economy. And so a structure like a business improvement district works really well in an environment where there's a lot of financial resources to draw from and a large level of civic engagement. The High Line is sort of an interesting twist on that story. In some ways, the High Line has become the economic driver that has then created a neighborhood that can support a park of this caliber. You can see here between 2003 and 2011, but the combination of sort of the anticipation and then construction of the first phase of the High Line and some changes in zoning code, property values within a third of a mile of the High Line increased by over 100%. So those increases in property values, changes in demographics, introduction of new businesses have cultivated sort of a ready-made fundraising pool that the Park Conservancy can then draw from. And Brooklyn Bridge Park similarly has had this combination of sort of private real estate development, but has also really transformed the sort of identity of downtown Brooklyn and has created some real shifts in terms of the sort of financial realities of real estate ownership immediately adjacent to the park. I wanted to introduce, just as sort of a counter example, the Bronx River Alliance, which is a group that was formed in 2001 by community activists who were interested in cleaning the Bronx River and creating more public access. And similar to the other conservancies that I just mentioned, the Bronx River Alliance was really the sort of brainchild of local residents who were committed to their community resource. But the focus has been very different. The fundraising has been mostly from foundations. There's some fundraising from local individuals, but there really isn't the sort of economic base in the areas immediately adjacent to the Bronx River to support the kinds of fundraising that are done in some of the other examples that were described. What the Bronx River Alliance has been extremely successful at doing is creating an identity and vision for their park, which has really galvanized community support and also galvanized for them the ability to articulate and promote the park to a funding audience, which then allows them to sort of further their efforts. So with that as I didn't know that was going to happen. As background, I wanted to introduce the organization that I work for, which is the Natural Areas Conservancy. And we are a relatively young public-private partnership. We were formed 3 years ago. And the story of our formation, I think, actually gives some interesting insight into sort of a growing appetite for this type of work across the country. In 2011, representatives from the Doris Duke Foundation approached the then Parks Commissioner, Adrian Benepe, and said that they were looking for the first time at funding a project that was really at the intersection of traditional conservation and urban issues. And they were specifically interested in partnering with the Parks Department on creating a new model that would marry those two disciplines together. And the proposal which was developed was to create a conservancy that would take the sort of structural model of some of the other conservancies, creating an independent nonprofit that was responsible for raising its own funds, hiring and supervising its own staff, to add value above and beyond what the public sector was able to support. But in this case, as opposed to working in a single park, we work across more than 50 parks spread across all 5 boroughs of New York City. And the geographic area that we cover is an area that's been a priority for New York City parks for over 30 years. There's a group called the Natural Resources Group, which has had the mandate to research and work across those places, but there have been some limitations in terms of capacity and dollars. And the idea was to create a new organization that could help bring sort of additional vision and resources to those areas. So in the last 3 years, since we officially launched as an organization, we've raised about $7 million. I'll briefly describe a little bit about the work that we do and then talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned and how they may apply to other cities. So the primary areas where we work are focused on bringing science and the creation of new data to solving problems, framing questions and solving problems related to urban ecology and urban land management. That work has informed efforts related to forest restoration and forest management, as well as coastal resilience and restoration in the more than 500 miles, I believe it is, of coastline for New York City. And increasingly, we are also working both with our own staff and also in partnership with the Parks Department and other partners to expand the capacity to work with volunteers and to engage the public directly in the use of these sites. I I just wanted to briefly give a couple of examples of the landscapes that we're describing. I'm not going to talk in any detail about these. I just wanted you to see them. I didn't realize this fade function was in place, so. So one of the things I wanted to talk about briefly was just the role that the private sector can play in bringing sort of new kinds of tools and awareness to some of these problems, especially at a regional scale. And I've shown just two of many potential examples. This is a map that was created by the University of Vermont as part of a project that we conducted. We assessed the biological condition of over 10,000 acres of forests and wetlands within New York City, and we also partnered with our colleagues at the U.S. Forest Service to conduct a social assessment to better understand how people are using natural areas. And one of the things that we found was that there's a level of ecological diversity that was surprisingly high. So this map shows more than 30 distinct ecological communities within the 5 boroughs. And a further analysis shows that over 40% of the land cover of New York City is characterized with some kind of green. And even perhaps more surprisingly, 13% of that is characterized with natural vegetation, which sort of strengthens our premise that there's the need to bring real science, urban ecology, botany, other disciplines that are usually thought of as sort of non-urban scientific disciplines into the urban realm. This is just an example that shows sort of the framework that we're using when we think about and partner with the Natural Resources Group to talk about sort of what we should be trying to achieve over the long term. So this is a summary of some of the research that we did looking at the condition of forests in New York City, trying to determine what's rare and common, and ultimately creating long-term management strategies for all of the different resources where we work that are based in science. So just speaking a little bit about fundraising challenges, here's a couple of things that we've identified that I'm sure many of you in this room can relate to. We struggle with ongoing, lingering negative perceptions of urban nature. In many places within New York City and across the country, natural spaces that look untended are still thought of as places where investment has not yet been made, rather than places that have a high intrinsic value. There can be a lack of local constituents or limited awareness, both about the existence of these places and also about their potential benefits and uses. We find ourselves frequently competing against traditional park needs, things like infrastructure, playground, recreational resources. And we also, as people sort of coming from a scientific background, can have a hard time talking about our work in a way that helps to sort of create bridges with the need for a focus on the human experience. We think, however, that there's some real opportunities to taking both a science-based and a regional approach to natural resource management in the urban setting. Increasingly, there's a focus on ecosystem services, so the quantifiable benefits that are provided by natural spaces in cities. Things like the mitigation of urban heat island effect, capturing stormwater, and benefits to human health. There's also an increase in the visibility of urban nature as more people begin to recreate within the urban context. We see real opportunities to target people who love living in cities and love recreating but don't necessarily recreate in cities, to help them sort of look to local parks and local opportunities as places to enjoy their free time. We know that environmental issues are better managed at a regional scale, and there's a lot of economies to scale to thinking about problems across a region and trying to address those problems regionally. And again, we see a real benefit to increase the use of science and data in land management. So I'm just going to, as I said, sort of tack on here at the end 3 kind of innovative approaches to fundraising that I think are worth mentioning and that I think we'll see more of in the future. The first is crowdsourcing, and I know some of you are probably familiar with a group called IOBI, which is an organization that was actually founded by some Yale Forestry alums, and they focus on raising small dollar amounts from local constituents. They've raised about $2 million to date for about 600 projects, and all of the funding comes from people who make pledges online. And one of the things I think is really interesting and wanted to mention is that the average donation is only about $35, but the average donation is also made by somebody who lives less than 2 miles from the project that they support. So this model actually is a great way to catalyze new projects, especially in communities where there's maybe just sort of a burgeoning sense of ownership around a natural space. And I think we'll see more of sort of a link between this type of fundraising and some of the natural resource management projects that we think about. Ooh, sorry. Not sure what happened. That's okay. I can just say the second thing that I wanted to mention is that New York City in 2016 will be launching a mitigation bank, which is a model that's intended to take sort of people who have individual responsibilities to mitigate negative environmental impact, in this case specifically related to wetlands remediation on their properties, and to do sort of bigger regional projects that have a higher level of environmental benefit, and to offer people the opportunity to pay for their offsets rather than doing them themselves. And we think we'll see a lot of increased environmental benefit from this model because it will allow people with a background in this topic to really set priorities for where the most impactful restoration should happen. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is payment for ecosystem services. And I know a lot of you are probably familiar with the idea of carbon offsets or payments for other kinds of greenhouse gas remediation or offsetting, but I think increasingly we'll see the opportunity to talk about the ecosystem service benefits of urban natural spaces and look for corporate social responsibility and other types of funding streams to support those efforts based on quantifiable data about the benefits provided. Not sure about this, but thank you.
I'm not quite sure where our tech specialist ended up. Just texted him? All right. So we might as well tell them we're annoyed. A final speaker on this panel who has a number of really wonderful slides, so we will want to bring this back up, is Dr. Mark Wilson. And Mark is the health officer of Jefferson County, which is Birmingham, Alabama. Before that, he was a general internist in indigent care in the hospital system there before he went on to the board of the Department of Health and then became the chief officer. I first read, people say, well, Brad, how did you run into this fellow? You do land trust type stuff. Well, it was through the Freshwater Land Trust, which has been a great partner of Dr. Wilson's, that they figured out that there's, in their case, tens of millions of dollars, if not more, to fund hundreds of miles of trails, if not more, as part of a combination natural areas restoration conservancy mixed with addressing obesity, diabetes, and other chronic diseases through activity, access to healthier food, and a variety of related programs. So, Mark, I may ask you to start describing the history. Can we go now? That may be right now. If it's up. Hopefully it's doing something. you want to start on anything while I play with this?
Good afternoon, everybody. Or from Alabama, I'll say, hey, y'all. Yeah, I hope I have pictures. Can you help me? Yeah, so as Brad said, I'm a medical doctor. I'm also my background is general internal medicine, and I would say now in public health. I've been in public health for 4 years now. I'm still a generalist, so unlike just about everybody else in this room, I'm not an expert in anything, okay? But it's really great to be here. 5 years ago, there's no way I would have imagined that I would be at a parks conference. It just wasn't part of my world. But I hope I can help you understand why it is important to public health. The reason that I am here again is not because I'm an expert, but because our health department decided to contribute $1 million towards building trails in Jefferson County. And as far as we know, we may be one of the only health departments in the country to have directly invested money in that. So that's where we are today. And is it advancing? There's not a keyboard I can use, is there?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can just use the keyboard. There we go. So that's really how I think I got on the radar screen, is giving away money. Okay. And just so you'll know, don't get the idea that your nearest health department is going to automatically give you $1 million. We are especially blessed where I am in terms of how we're set up in our revenue stream, which comes from some earmarked sales tax. That we've been in a very strong financial position. Thank you. And able to do this. So, but still, I think one of the big take-home lessons here is still you need to partner with public health for at least advocacy around the work that you do. So in Jefferson County, and this is, we have a particular problem with obesity. It's an epidemic. We know it's a national problem, but the South, where I live, seems to suffer disproportionately. 66% of adults are overweight or obese. And also very disturbing, our children at a pretty young age, a lot of them are becoming obese. And by the time they reach the 3rd grade, if they're obese, it's very unlikely that they will become non-obese later in their life. And then also we have some data that shows that that 31% of adults reported no physical activity, other than their daily routine, no exercise in the last 30 days. We believe that today's children actually have a life expectancy shorter than their parents. The first time this has happened in modern history in the United States. And a lot of that will be from diabetes, from obesity, and coronary disease and other things related to that. So just want to give a brief lesson in terms of what determines our health, or factors that affect our health. Make sure everybody understands, and this is really basic public health. On your left there, you'll see just an estimate of the impact that different things have on our health. Behaviors is really the main one, just our lifestyle, and the environment, which is actually about 20%, and then genetics, which is about 20%, and then medical care, where we spend, this is not up to date, in 2011 we were spending $2.2 trillion on medical care or health problems. 96% of that was medical services, and only 4% of that was prevention. So as you can see, things are a little bit upside down. This is one of my favorite slides. This was a concept developed by our Tom Frieden, the director of the CDC. And I'm not going to go through all the details of this, but it's a pyramid that just shows you what has the biggest impacts in our health. as a population versus the smallest impact, or the biggest bang for your buck versus the least. So down at the bottom are socioeconomic factors, things like education, just simply wealth. If you're wealthy and well educated, you're going to be a lot healthier than if you're not. Notice at the top of the pyramid, clinical interventions, medical care that we spend the most of our money on, is relatively ineffective in the long run. And at the very top, counseling and education. If we just tell people to exercise, tell people to eat right, tell people not to smoke, it all sounds great, but it doesn't have much of an impact. So a lot of the impact that I want you to focus on is that second from the bottom tier, changing the context. As some of the examples here are things that we're more familiar with in public health, but the work that you all do in the area of parks and open spaces, outdoor spaces, and in helping people connect to that and more naturally just go out and get exercise, that has a lot of potential, and that's in that category of changing the context in which people live so that the healthy choice becomes more automatic, or as we say, the healthy choice becomes the easy choice. I sort of see it as a triple win when we build trails, greenways, and parks and make them readily accessible to people. We have increased amenities for exercise. We have alternatives to transportation. In Birmingham, where I am, we're a car city. We have a few buses, no rail, and we have an air pollution issue there. And then win number 3 is a little bit more nebulous, but very important, and we see it. When we build parks and recreation spaces, we create a more vibrant, livable community, which has ultimately greater economic prosperity in general, which, again, those are those major determinants of health, which make our overall population healthier. And these are just some more specific benefits that since I'm the public health person, I'm the medical doctor, I'm going to list to you. I think you know most of them. Weight control, if we get just regular physical activity, better weight control, lower risk of several health conditions, lower medical costs, prolonged life. I love the statistics from the CDC. If we follow their recommendations of 30 minutes per day, 5 days per week of just walking briskly, we can add an average of 3 years to our life. Improved mood, decreased stress, increased energy, better sleep. Benefit of just time outdoors, even when it's not a lot of exercise. When children are outdoors, they naturally get more exercise. There's this concept you may have heard of, nature deficit disorder, and children that may be suffering ill effects from being indoors too much. Not a medical diagnosis, but a concept I think that deserves some thought. Time in nature lowers stress levels. Natural light helps prevent depression. Natural light helps maintain vitamin D levels needed for good health. Time in nature may improve healing, shorten healing time from surgery, and improve our immune systems. Not great medical evidence for this, but some evidence that is building. And often the air outside is cleaner than the air inside. We really struggle with that in some of our inner city areas where people are very aware of the pollution issues in Birmingham, and they're afraid that if they go outside, they're going to get sick. But it's actually the opposite is true. And then benefit of just having walkable neighborhoods with people outside walking. More of the social benefits, improved sense of social stability, connection with others, improved property values, and of course if walking replaces driving, it saves money and lowers pollution. And then more pedestrian activity actually reduces street crime by providing more eyes on the street. This is just one study. It was compiling different studies in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine that showed that creation of enhanced access to spaces for physical activity combined with informational outreach produced a 48% increase in the frequency of physical activity. So in Birmingham, we were very fortunate years ago, about a decade ago, some of the philanthropic community came together and decided that they were going to do a major initiative to raise money to build 2 new parks, large parks in Birmingham area, Railroad Park and Red Mountain Park, in addition to build a new nature center at Ruffner Mountain Park, to actually increase the amount of acreage per capita in Birmingham of green space to be greater than any other city in the country. So that set the stage for us. Now I'm going to shift gears just a little bit to let you know how it sort of works in public health departments. We all utilize a community-wide strategic planning process for health called Mobilizing for Action Through Planning and Partnerships, or MAP. This is endorsed by the National Association of County and City Health Officials, and also our accreditation board for public health. So all your health departments, or virtually all of them, are using this process for a community-wide health assessment and strategic planning process, not for the health department itself, but for the whole community, whether it's a city, a county, or a state, or a tribe in some cases. This was ours in 2006, called our Community Roadmap to Health. And out of that, in 2007, after we came up with this strategic plan for the community, we formed the Health Action Partnership in order to implement that plan. This is how we're organized, the Health Action Partnership. We have a leadership team with representation from very diverse sectors of the community. We have priority groups that focus on a particular strategic issue, and then we have members within each of those groups. Very importantly, we have backbone organizations that help keep it all running. You can't have a partnership without somebody to keep it on track and provide the resources to keep it going. So we have our local community foundation, our health department, and the United Way of Central Alabama. They provide some staff support full-time for this. Just to give you a flavor for our leadership team, we have our Freshwater Land Trust, one of our major partners. We have business community, public health, education, academia, and health insurance companies, some community organizations, regional planning commission. These are all part of our partnership centered around public health. These are all part of our what we call our public health system. You all are part of the public health system in your community. You may or may not know it, but you are, because what you do contributes to health, or what, in some cases, what people do may actually have an adverse effect on health. But either way, we all have an impact. These were our original 4 priority groups: healthy children and youth, tobacco-free living, livable communities, and healthy food choices. So one of the main ones that we're focused on here is livable communities. Then, because of our partnership in Birmingham, we were able to win a major CDC grant for obesity and tobacco. We got over $13 million. About half of that went towards obesity. We used some of that money to sponsor a study by the university, the School of Public Health, to look at whether if we build green space and trails, will they come? So they did a phone survey and basically found that, again, a large proportion of people were physically inactive, but they were asked if they were given ready access to these amenities, places to walk, parks, would they become? And they used that data and then matched it with some CDC data to estimate that in Jefferson County, a population of about 660,000 people, we could save between $20 and $40 million a year in healthcare costs. We did a planning process for a trail system with a lot of community engagement, over 3,000 people, several different meetings, hired a facilitation group and then a design group, and then came up with a master plan for a trail system for Jefferson County. Those just show the main corridors. There are 250 miles of off-street trails, about 750 miles of connectors, street connectors. And then this is where we contributed $1 million. We had an opportunity to get a Tiger grant. That's a transportation investment grant, part of the stimulus package. And so that was part of the local match with other partners, including the Freshwater Land Trust, to help the city of Birmingham win $10 million. So it was a total of $15 million to start building the trail system. That included Civil Rights Trail, helping embrace our history in Birmingham. This is in a fairly low-income neighborhood. And then another trail, East Thomas Park Trail, again in a low-income neighborhood. And some challenges here, again, getting to the sustainability maintenance issue. A lot of people in that neighborhood are afraid to use that trail. They're just afraid to go out. They're afraid of crime. So we have some issues to overcome there. And then this is the one that our health department directly sponsored. This is a high ore line. It's a railroad track, a railroad bed that's elevated. It's under construction currently, should be finished in about a month. This is a new health department facility that we have in the western side of town. Again, a more low-income area. That trail begins a couple blocks from here with connections and then ends at Red Mountain Park, which you may have heard of. A huge park on the mountain that overlooks the city. Some old artifacts from the old mining industry. Lots of fun. Ropes course, zip line, rappelling tower. And they now have goats. You were talking earlier about honeysuckle. The goats are used here to get rid of the kudzu and the privet. I think their goal is to have 150 goats. And then finally, our health department, along with the Freshwater Land Trust, influenced our Rotary Trail for their 100-year centennial to build a trail downtown called the Rotary Trail, which is a below-ground railroad bed where a lot of water used to collect and go directly into the streams. This is going to be a design to help keep that water from going into the streams. Be a beautiful trail with a new Magic City sign that was once part of Birmingham, and connect the new railroad park, which is like our little baby Central Park downtown, with Sloss Furnaces, which is an old iron furnace that's now a visitor area, a visitor attraction. And just we are also very blessed in Birmingham just to have a lot of natural beauty. This is the Cahaba River, and the Cahaba River, the Cahaba lily, which is unique to that area. A lot of unique species are in that area. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you. Look forward to questions.
Sarah and Catherine? Hoped. We saw a wide range of possibilities there for sustaining parks over time, everything from volunteer organizations to millions of dollars in DOT grants and everything in between. So actually, I wanted to do something that doesn't happen very often on panels first. Catherine, I don't know if you have any questions for the other panelists, or then we'll go down the list and start there maybe.
Sure. So I wanted to find out, first of all, Mark, you said the health department decided to invest $100 million. How did
Not
you...
$100 million, $1 million.
Oh, $1 million, okay.
We don't have $100 million.
That's pretty remarkable. But how did you get to that point? Was this something that you brought about, or how did that happen?
The idea was preceded me slightly. My predecessor had the idea of investing. I think a lot of it did come out of just having those partnerships in place. And our Freshwater Land Trust director, whom Brad knows, is a real dynamo and very influential. So if it had not been for her leadership, I don't think we would have necessarily thought of doing this. But I will tell you that most health departments are thinking about that infrastructure, the built environment. That's a big part of what we think about in public health. So I think as parks people or land trust people or conservancy people, you need to establish that relationship and make that argument. I think when you make the argument, it will make sense to the public health department. And a lot of this is about relationships, having those relationships. And then once you have them, when opportunities come your way, then you can start connecting dots. We recently got another CDC grant. And again, none of these grants we would have gotten if we had not had the partnerships in place and all the pieces in place so that when the opportunity comes, we're ready to go.
And Sarah, I was interested in this relationship between collecting data, research, and advocacy. Are you allowed to, tell me a little bit about how you relate to the public agency, and if in fact advocates can use your data and if you help them with it.
Sure, yeah. I guess I'll say a sort of a two-part answer to that question. The first is that as an organization that's only 3 years old, we're still in the early stages of sharing a lot of our data for the first time. So it took us about 2.5 years to do this citywide sort of baseline assessment, and we've just in the last year been sort of starting to share those results with different organizations. So the data that we generated is being used, for example, right now by the Office of City Planning to review some special zoning districts in the borough of Staten Island. And we've been sharing it with other research partners and in some cases with community groups. But we actually just hired a design consultant who's going to be helping us produce a bunch of sort of public-facing products to share the information. So in some ways that's still sort of a work in progress. But the one specific example that I did want to give about how we're sort of thinking more long-term about using our data for advocacy is, as many people who are familiar with New York City might know, the Million Trees program, which was intended to be a 10-year initiative, ended up being an 8-year initiative to plant 1 million new trees in the 5 boroughs. It's coming to an end this year, and so we have been working closely with our colleagues at the Parks Department to try to frame and then promote sort of a next approach to long-term management. So thinking about sort of what comes after that campaign and having a more data-driven approach to those next steps.
Sarah, do you have a question for either of our panelists?
Yeah, actually, my first question is for you.
Big surprise. No, that's okay. I got more.
One of the things that we've been increasingly focused on is working at the intersection of public access and ecological restoration, and we have a couple of projects we're working on right now where we're using either trail construction or trail closure as a way to improve the biological condition of places, and I'm wondering if that conversation came up in your trail planning process at all.
Not that I know of. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know that it did. Yeah.
Knowing Wendy Jackson, the executive director of Freshwater Land Trust, and the focus of the land trust on biodiversity and endangered species and whatnot, I'm sure they figured out a way to touch on it. But I also know that they're really focused on raising the resources to do this work, and have tapped into some pretty remarkable communities. You mentioned the Rotary Trail, as I understand it, but you should correct me. In Birmingham, the two sort of civic business groups, the Kiwanis and the Rotary, Wendy's got them competing with each other to see who can give more to green space and trail activation. So you have a wonderful competition there. But that leads into a question we talked a little bit about at dinner last night on, we're talking about new or improved natural areas as part of the sort of revitalization of some parts of these cities, which leads to a variety of economic benefits, but also raises all sorts of questions about displacement and inequality. And how are you all hoping or seeing that those sorts of issues are addressed in your programs? Catherine, maybe I'll start with you, or what sorts of models are you seeing that sort of help square that circle?
Sure. As I mentioned last night, I just read about, it's called an equity development policy that is being introduced in Washington, D.C. There's a proposal for to make a bridge, 11th Street Bridge, that goes over the Anacostia into a park, and it'll connect two very different kinds of communities. And so one is underserved and the other one has received a lot of economic investment. And so the idea is to kind of embed this into the development process as the park is built, so that jobs go to the local communities, so that affordable housing is protected. And I don't know if there are others around the country, but it's an interesting one that I've observed.
Sarah, how about
Sure. I'll actually give three very brief answers. One is, as Commissioner Silver mentioned today, I think Parks Without Borders and the Community Parks Initiative are good examples of work that's happening in New York that's really intended to target communities that haven't had a lot of investment. And I think by working, especially in a lot of places at once, you sort of minimize the likelihood that you're going to radically change a single neighborhood and sort of transform that landscape. Another thing that I wanted to mention, which sort of refers back to something that my colleague Jennifer Greenfield said, is a lot of the natural areas where we work tend to be sort of outer edges of outer boroughs. And so there's a lot of reasons based on sort of proximity and transit accessibility why those neighborhoods frequently are not sort of candidates for rapid gentrification, but they are places that could definitely improve their public access. And so picking where to work, and in our case, working where there's a lot of natural resources tends to give us some benefits that sort of don't fit into that. You fix it and then it becomes, you know, the next hottest neighborhood. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is we're piloting a program this coming summer where we're going to be working on sort of hyper local job recruiting with a high school age population for a trail improvement project in Brooklyn. And I think that kind of direct connection between the creation of new opportunities through park construction and development and making sure that the sort of job opportunities and workforce development stays extremely local to people who live and work sort of immediately adjacent to the park is another nice way to help kind of counter that tendency.
Mark?
Yeah, I think for us in Birmingham, the excitement that comes from around developing the trail systems and the parks that are mostly near downtown, coupled with a new popularity of living downtown, it's created a lot of buzz, which I think is good for everybody. At the same time, we're trying to focus on, and especially in the public health and our partners, focusing on trying to get some of those same amenities to the outlying neighborhoods where there isn't a lot of economic activity at the same time. I think some gentrification around the periphery of the downtown area is going to be inevitable, but we do have some community partners and some community development organizations that are very committed to helping people maintain their own property, keep their own property, and keep it a mixed-use type environment. So, but I think it is a real concern. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I think we'll open it up for questions from the audience. I think we have Mike, question in the back first. If I could ask everybody to state their name and their organization as they ask the question, that would be great.
Please. Well, thank you all for being here. My name is Drew Goldsman, and I'm with the Nature Conservancy here in Connecticut. And just building off of some of the work that Natural Areas Conservancy is doing around baselines and metrics, my question is actually for Dr. Wilson. In terms of kind of health baselines and health metrics and measuring success in terms of the health impacts of some of these green infrastructure or open space investments, I know there's a lot of good literature out there that you more or less referenced in terms of the benefits we know associated with active recreation and green space. I'm just wondering if you are, how are you measuring those impacts? I think a challenge that we've had, and I think is a bit of a challenge in general, is at scale it's a bit more measurable, but understanding the value of an individual tree and an individual tree planting program becomes a little bit more nebulous. And yeah, so that's my question.
So yeah, there are huge challenges, I think, for us. I mean, a lot of people look to public health to have the health data on our community, but the fact is we don't really have great data. When we decided to invest in the trail system, initially I wanted us to do some type of study with some baseline actual data of the people that live near that trail, and then to remeasure periodically, especially focusing on children where we can have more of an impact. But the cost of doing that was just prohibitive. The data that I quoted to you is all based on phone survey data. A lot of it is done by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the CDC for us. And so my personal opinion is that we're going to have to take some of the best evidence that we have and just a dose of common sense and then take a leap of faith on some of this. That's just my opinion. We are going to be doing some follow-up surveys on the trail that we're building, but we've changed the focus on really asking people, whether they use the trails or not, and then asking more questions about what are the barriers, if not, why not, just to help educate us locally more on a strategy to improve, to break down those barriers in the future and just learn at that sort of scale. The other problem is there are just too many variables. You can't control for all of those variables. And again, a lot of the effects we're seeing are going to be very long-term effects. And that's another challenging thing for funding. Some of the local funders, especially healthcare systems, which I think are other good partners like hospitals, health insurance companies, good partners, but they're not going to see a real fast return on investment.
Jeanette Ikovics at the School of Public Health here has been doing some work with Colleen on the health benefits of green spaces, trying to prove out a model from a sort of correlated data point of view, and they're quite excited about the results. But Catherine's also doing a study in which NIH is involved. Is there anything coming out of that study that might be relevant to this question?
Sure. So the study it's a 4-year national longitudinal study, the first in the country, where we're looking at neighborhood scale parks between 2 and 20 acres to try to understand whether or not people are using those parks and what level of physical activity they're getting. And we've, in each of the 25 cities, looked at 6 to 10 parks using data collectors who are actually observing who's in those parks, and they're counting several times a day, several days during the week. I was at a discussion here earlier this year where we reported that what we're finding is that in a lot of these parks, where there's disinvestment, people are not using them, and that's not surprising. But where people are getting the most amount of activity is actually in walking paths and trails. And so, many of these neighborhood parks, as you saw in the pictures, are, they've got a fence around them. And I think it would be a simple addition or change just to incorporate a walking path that anybody could use. The second big finding was that very few seniors are using these parks. They represent now about 18% of the population. I think only 3 to 4% are actually in these parks. So I think there's great opportunity for programming, and again, it can be very simple. We're about to begin the second round of observations that'll take place next spring, and then the analysis will happen in 2017.
Next question. Give me the mic up here.
Hi, I'm Erica Svensson with the U.S. Forest Service. Thank you. This panel has been great. All the panels have been great. But just wanted to reflect on the wonderful public-private partnerships or forms of governance that have been discussed on this panel. There seems to be more private than public in some of those models. What is the role of government, you think, today, different from 100 years ago? What should government be doing at the federal, state, and local level? Because I'm going to make it happen. No. Just curious.
Well, I mean, just thinking about sort of the author of some of these concepts, Bill Birch would always say, volunteers can get things started, but the governments need to maintain them over time. Is that model changing? Are we now seeing volunteers being enabled to maintain parks over the longer term, do you think? Sarah, it looks like you should.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think that there's, especially in the kinds of places where we do a lot of our work, and in places, as you mentioned, where they're more sort of localized neighborhood parks, the role of government, I think, is more important than ever in many ways. And there's definitely been a sort of systematic disinvestment in a lot of basic services within some cities for parks. And I think the role of the private sector or nonprofit sector can be really powerful in shaping priorities, bringing awareness, and being kind of the matchmaker between some of the community efforts and government agencies. But I definitely think it's not intended to replace the role of government.
So I think they should, government should be providing the essential services. And quite frankly, it's hard to raise private dollars for maintenance. Anybody will tell you that. Initially, these nonprofits were established to, restore the historic parks, bring in the extra expertise that the public sector didn't have. And I see over time is that, what's the interesting balance is that, some of these nonprofits are able to actually drive the innovation and take the risk that the public sector can't. So I think that there's a great, I personally think there's a great balance in bringing the different areas of expertise and strengths that both the public and the private sector have, different areas of resources, particularly as you're looking at projects that will happen over a long period of time where you're going to be, moving from one administration to another and where priorities might change, but you need someone to keep that long-term vision alive.
Mark, you talked about public partnerships, so I assume you have a view on the evolving role, but a critical role of government here?
Yes, if you ask most of the politicians in Alabama, they'll say there is no role of government. So that's a little bit of an obstacle we have to overcome. But yeah, I think we're partnering with city governments and, whether it's the city of Birmingham or some of the other 34 towns we have in our county. And so I think that partnership between public health and local government is really important. And yeah, I agree that they need to be able to help sustain some of this. But a lot of the governments that we have, especially the smaller towns, they just don't have the wherewithal to do this. So I think we'll be trying to help find ways to help them, at least get them built, and then if not maintained.
And my impression is that a lot of the public sector work in Birmingham has done the planning that enabled the Kiwanis and the Rotary and others and foundations to come in.
Yeah, that was the beauty of the master plan, is it's there for anybody to use and to plug into, whether you're a municipality or a private foundation, what have you. It's already planned for you, at least the backbone of it.
Just going to make sure that we don't have any questions on this side of the room. You guys have kind of been ignored over the course of the day. I'll go back to this. Going once, going twice. Over here.
There's an interesting book by David Schuyler called The Sacred Landscape, and he talks about that in the earlier years, in the 1800s, that the philanthropers, I guess you would call them the 1% of the 1800s, that they were more responsible for investing in the landscape and putting money into things like this, and that today that things have changed, so that we need to go back to what they were saying, when a big development is built, have them invest in the parks, local parks, to, if they're not doing it on their own, maybe build it into the way parks operate, So that's an interesting book that talks about that.
Mm-hmm. Are you seeing a lot of that in the areas you're working, sort of more regulatorily required open spaces? Obviously, New York's doing a lot of that. Are you seeing that in Birmingham as you have new developments alongside the parks? Are they required to contribute to the parks or expand the parks?
No, not just in terms of finances. With our stormwater management laws and things, obviously there are certain things that have to be done there. But I do think there's an increasing recognition. With our railroad park, the development around there has just taken off. So I do think that there's an opportunity to say, hey, look at how this did benefit you. So let's think about a way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yep, on the front here. Give you guys an opportunity for closing thoughts. Maybe if we don't get a lot more questions.
Sarah, I'm from the New Haven Land Trust, and you had talked about an assessment that was done to understand the value of natural spaces within the urban context. And I wondered if you could just elaborate on that process, what you got out of it, and how you approached it.
Do you want to say anything about the social assessment? Yeah, so I would be happy to. So the way that we sort of structured our study was we had a team of biological scientists who were looking at condition of sort of health condition of forests grasslands and wetlands. And then we partnered actually with several of the people in this room from the U.S. Forest Service to conduct a companion social assessment, which involved a combination of direct interviews, observational recordings, and then sort of signs of human use. And we're actually in the process now of looking at ways to spatially overlay that information to look for patterns and relationships between the sort of biological health of the places where we researched, and then sort of what patterns of use were in those places. So there was definitely some interesting preliminary results coming out of the social assessment. Specifically, I think one of the things that was kind of the most fascinating, at least to me, was that there was a lot more travel to sort of between outer borough neighborhoods to outer borough parks than we originally anticipated. It sort of turned upside down a little bit the idea that there's these big flagship parks that people will travel far distances to go to, and then they're sort of everywhere else. And definitely in our first year of research looking at parks in and around Jamaica Bay, there was a surprisingly high percentage, I think it was over 30, it might have been close to 40% of people who were traveling to several of these sort of remote neighborhood parks who were coming from further than a mile away, which is a long distance to travel sort of within an urban setting. But in terms of kind of big picture relationships, we're still kind of looking at the relationship between those two data sets.
Any other questions? Yep.
Thanks for a great conversation. You spoke a lot about the benefits of some of these hybrid models of funding and revenue from concessions or bid-like kind of zoning. Are there any risks associated with that? You could see a city government saying, oh, well, you already have this revenue. We don't need to invest in public space like we used to because there's these new revenue streams. So the upsides are clear, but can you maybe speculate about some of the downsides?
Sure. I mean, you know, if a surrounding neighborhood does suffer economically and you're relying on that source of support, of course, the public realm's going to suffer. But I think we need to hold government accountable as well. You know, in so many of these communities, the government really, for a variety of reasons, has not been able to perform services at the level that is needed. And you know, I think the risks are, yes, if government just, you know, cedes control and says, private sector just take over, we won't do it. I mean, again, we need to have a strong public sector, but I think the private can only enhance that.
Great. One last question, maybe, in the middle here.
Yeah, I thought the Birmingham example with the trails and using the Tiger grant was, you know, a pretty innovative approach. And I was just wondering if, you know, the panel has come across any other good examples of using infrastructure or civil infrastructure to promote construction or maintenance of parks. I guess, you know, there's roads get built, you know, utilities get installed, but parks, you know, departments never have any money. I'm just wondering if you know, seeing any synergies there in your work.
Sarah, you want to start?
I'll actually just mention there was a federal DOT grant was just awarded to complete the final portion of the Bronx River Greenway, which is a project that's been under development for over 15 years. And it's just another similar example of where a lot of very grassroots community work went into sort of getting the project started. City investment sort of came in over time. But in the end, there's going to be this sort of big push with, I think it's, again, about a $10 million grant of federal funds that will allow for the completion of sort of the final section, which kind of shows, I guess, both sort of the cumulative nature of some of this fundraising work and also some creative thinking about bringing in sort of a non-traditional revenue source for greenway construction.
My guess is that around water, temperature, health, food, you're going to see a lot more public agencies saying, can we come together here? I think there's probably a fascinating panel for the future about how do you get public agencies working across their silos effectively on these kinds of questions. But I think with that, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking the panel.
I know that was the last question, but can I comment on that?
Sure. This is our keynote speaker, so he'll be up next. So he's
We raised $125 million in capital, of which $38 million were federal transportation funds, $10 million were state transportation funds, which are really federal pass-throughs. The full disclosure, it was an earmark. Okay, earmarks are much despised, but they're one of the ways that federal politicians got money into their local districts, and that is what built the roads and bike paths of our project. So, and what I'll tell you, particularly at the state level, every politician knows where to find money in their budget. And so, and the budgets are thick, and they've got all these little hidden pots here and there. And if you build a constituency and go to them with a good project, with a sustaining business model, so they know they're not going to come back in a couple of years and ask them to operate it, there is money to be found.
Wonderful transition to our next speaker. Thank you.